Well, good afternoon. My name is John Cox, and I'm going to be talking today about leadership. And what I want to do is just give people some principles that will help them to be better leaders. And the idea here is if you're in a church or you're in a school or you're teaching somewhere and leading, your goal is not just to be a good leader yourself. Your goal is to help produce other leaders. And it comes right out of 2 Timothy 2:2, where Paul, writing to Timothy, who is a new leader just getting established, he says, and the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men who will also be qualified to teach others. Now, in Dallas, in our church, we have a lot of leaders. In fact, we've got almost 1,000 community group leaders. And if I was to come up here and line them all on the stage, and I was down here, I was to put our very worst leader out of 1,000. Now, think what that must be like, okay? And then I was to come down here, and down here is our very best leader, right? Like this person, they would give Jesus a run for their money in discipling the disciples, okay? And in a good day. And then if I was to ask you, hey, come up and stand somewhere along this line, just where you think your leadership skills are today, where would you stand? Now, I mentioned some of us would kind of be down here, and we're new at this. Others of us, we've been experienced, and we're kind of down here. And yet, all of us, right, all of us interact with people that are at all different points along that continuum every day. And so what we want to do is talk about how do we teach other people how to lead? And to do that, you've got to have a simple way to make a very complex thing understandable. And the way I like to do it is to talk about it in 3 levels. The first thing is how do you lead yourself? The second is how do I lead others one-on-one, just in everyday interactions? And the last one is how do I lead teams or groups? Now, we're going to cover just the first one here in this short time. I'll cover the next 2 in a breakout session we've got a little later this afternoon. But let's talk about how do you lead yourself well? Because what I've realized over the years is that I am the most difficult person that I lead. Right? I have the most challenges with me. And if I can get my act together, then everything else is going to flow from there. And so every time I meet with a new leader, I just start off by saying, hey, listen, in ministry, leadership is about who you are, not what you say. If you've got 15 minutes with someone, then what you say really matters. But if you're with them for 15 days or 15 weeks or for 15 months, then what you say doesn't matter at all. It's how you live. And so the guy who led me to Christ, who, by the way, introduced me to my wife, right? I was around him for 6 or 7 years. I can't remember a single thing he ever told me, right? But I can tell you dozens of stories about how he lived and examples that I learned from that. And so when we think about leading ourselves, I just want to talk about 3 things. Number 1, right, is the people that lead themselves well, they understand that they are not in charge. God's in charge. And what's interesting is that now having been around the church, I didn't grow up in the church, but now having been around the church for about 30 years, you know what the 2 biggest surprises to me in 30 years of ministry are? The biggest surprise is how much God changes people. And, that shouldn't surprise me, but it always does because it's always so dramatic. And then the other thing is that it's never who I think it will be, right? Like if you made me predict in advance, who is the person that's going to get radically transformed? I wouldn't have a very good track record. So that's the biggest surprise to me. You know what the second biggest surprise to me is? It's how little other people change, right? So you've got the same church, the same messages, the same groups. One person gets totally and radically transformed. Another person, they don't change at all. In fact, they kind of slide backwards probably. And if I was to step back and ask you today, fully recognizing that it is God who transforms, right? So we could go to 1 Corinthians 3, where Paul just writes, look, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God caused the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow, right? So fully acknowledging that it is God who makes things grow, right? If we were to look at the lives of the people that are transformed, we would see some common denominators. And if we were to look at the lives of the people that don't change at all, we would see some common denominators. And do you know what I think the biggest single difference is between the people that get transformed and the ones that don't? The biggest, does anybody want to guess? Okay, I assume that's a no. all right? I think the biggest single difference is how you view God, right? The radically transformed people are the ones who believe that at their core, God is good, and he can be trusted. And the ones who don't change at all are the ones who have doubts about that, and they never put their faith in him. And by that, I just simply mean, not when things are going well, but when things are going badly. When you're not getting what you expect, when your plans and God's plans are different plans, right? So many years ago, when I was 27 years old, I went and tried to start a church in the Virginia suburbs of D.C. And I learned a couple of things. One, church planting is a lot harder than you think. And I did just about everything wrong you could possibly do in starting a church, right? And so several years into this church, I'm at a point where things are not looking good. And I'm wrestling with that. And when that happens to people, and they're getting what they don't expect, they're going to do one of a couple of things. Sometimes they blame God, right? They say, God, you're responsible for this. Now, other times they'll say, well, it's not God, it must be me. If I wasn't such an idiot, this wouldn't have happened to me, okay? Now, if you're really creative, you'll find someone else to blame. You'll blame somebody else for why you're in your situation. And you may think, okay, that sounds crazy. But how many people do you know that say to themselves, hey, if I wasn't married to this person, right, my marriage would be much better. Or if my boss wasn't such an idiot, right, my work situation would be much better. And so the first thing about leading yourself well is understanding that you are not in charge. And that God's plans, his plans are different than your plans, right? And the best thing you can do is you can get on board with his plans and understand, you know what? If things are not going well, the story is not over. And God's going to work it out. Because that's the business he's in, taking bad things and bringing good out of them. Right? But the first key difference I see in people leading themselves well is, can they say, I'm not in charge, God's in charge, I'm following him no matter what. Now, the second key characteristic of leading yourself well is understanding how God has made you and what you are good at. What are the gifts that he's given you? Because when it comes to giftedness, you want to lock down on your strengths. And what I have learned in ministry is the hardest people to work with in ministry are the ones that are deceived about what they're good at. Okay? Can I get an amen to that? Okay, all right. So they're the hardest people to work with. And yet, you know what? Figuring out what it is you're good at, that takes a lot of work. And, I told you I went and started a church. When I started that church, I thought I was a pretty decent communicator. And you know what I realized? I realized that part of being a really good communicator is you better be creative. Because if you're not creative, you run out of all your best illustrations and stories and insightful points very quickly. And it wasn't but about 6 months into that church experience when I was having to do 2 messages a week, and I felt like I was having to write papers in college. And I don't know about you, but I avoided classes in college where I had to write papers, okay? Because I didn't like it. And so now this is not pouring life into me. And what's even worse is the people in my congregation are telling me, you're okay, but you're not great, okay? That is not what you want to hear if you're the leader. Now, the other gift that you really need if you're going to start a church is you better be a pretty good shepherd, okay? And I was not a good shepherd, right? Like someone would come into me, they would have a problem, I would pray with them, we would look at the scriptures, I would give them some advice, and out they would go. And about a month would roll by, and they would come back, and they were in the same ditch. And I would say, well, did you do what I asked you to do? And they would say, what? No. Right? Now I'm out of counsel, okay? I'm done. And so if you looked at the people in my church, what you would see is the ones that were thriving were the self-starters, right? The leaders. But the truth is you could throw them in the desert with a Bible and they would grow, okay? And the ones that were struggling were the ones who were saying, I need someone to come alongside of me, love me, encourage me, shepherd me, and walk with me. And so I found myself in a spot where I was in a role that did not line up well with my gifts. If you're going to be a small church starting pastor, You better be able to speak, and you better be able to shepherd. And just step back. And that was one of the most painful experiences for me, but stepping back and saying, okay, God, well, what gift have you given me? And then where do I go to develop that? And what I see a lot of times in ministry is that people get into ministry because they want to love and follow God, but also sometimes because they have role models that they look up to. And they say to themselves, I want to be just like that person. Okay? The problem is that God has not given them the exact same gifts as that person. And if you're trying to be someone that you weren't created to be, it is not going to go well with you. Okay? And so what we try and do, and what I try and do with the people at Watermark, is help them to identify how has God gifted them, and then how do we get them into roles that maximize that giftedness. Right? So number one, you're not in charge, God is. You've got to follow him. Number two, what are the gifts God's given you, and how do you use those well? Okay? The third thing in leading yourself well is, now I said when it comes to giftedness, focus on your strengths. When it comes to character, you better focus on your weaknesses. And you better understand, if I'm going to fall, what are the three most likely reasons that's going to happen? Because if you don't know, you're in trouble already. Because what will happen is because ministry is hard, because it's emotionally taxing, right? There is going to come a day when you're going to be tempted. And I don't know anybody who's ever started out in ministry looking to shipwreck their ministry, okay? But I personally now can count probably 50 people that I've known that have done exactly that. And they just got surprised. And so what are those issues for you that would cause you to get into trouble? Okay? Now for me, doesn't look like it today, but for me, one of those is my anger. Okay? I have 5 kids. They're ages 15, 13, 12, 10, and 8. Okay? So I get lots of practice. Okay? And in my house, it basically goes like this. I am patient, I'm patient, I'm patient, I've had it, okay? And when I've had it, people run, okay? And, my wife, who is from Tennessee, we live in Dallas, that's about 10 hours car trip. Every once in a while, we get into our 2002 Honda Odyssey minivan, and we make the 700-mile drive to go see our family. And several years ago, we're not more than 10 minutes into this journey, and my kids in the back, they start fighting, okay? Now, I've got one daughter who is responsible for about 60% of the drama in my house all by herself, okay? All right? And she is stirring it up in the back, okay? And so I am cajoling, I am threatening, I am bribing, and it is not working, okay? So finally, I got to stop this. I am not going to make it another 20 miles, let alone another 680 miles, okay? And so my first thought is, well, I could always stop the car and get out and go back and deal with it, okay? Now, one thing you need to know about me is I am a guy. I am not stopping the car, okay? All right? The car is continuing to roll towards Tennessee. All right, so then I think, okay, I'm going to throw something. That's what I'm going to do, okay? And I look down and I see this full water bottle sitting right next to me, okay? And I'm thinking, I'm going to throw that, okay? And I was crazy, but I wasn't that, that might hurt someone, okay? So I'm driving on the wheel, and then I see a tissue box, okay? So I reach over, I grab this tissue box, I'm driving, and I launch it as hard as I can throw it back at the one child who is responsible for 60% of the drama in my house, okay? I miss her. I hit her sister, okay? Who acts like I have shot her, okay? Okay? Breaks out hysterically crying that her dad would hit her with a tissue box. And me, in all my maturity, was thinking, good, at least they have something to be upset about now, okay? And so, I'm still driving, and it's like 1001, 1002, 1003, and the tissue box comes flying back up, okay? Hits the dashboard. And my very first thought is this, who wants a part of me, right? Okay? And so, but then I thought, oh my gosh, what am I teaching my kids about how to deal with anger? And look, the truth about me is that, is left to myself, my anger is going to wreck my family, okay? Because it's patient. And I don't know if any of you ever grew up with an angry dad, okay? But I do not want my kids growing up thinking they had an angry father. And so that's one of my Achilles heel. That is one of my character flaws. Okay. Now, for other people, it could be, materialism or security, or it could be lust, or it could be all kinds of things, right? But whatever it is, you got to identify it, and you got to deal with it proactively and aggressively so it does not get you. Now, for me, that just simply means all of the guys in my accountability group, they ask me every week, when is the last time you raised your voice with your kids? Okay? And I've got now about 15 verses memorized that when I start to feel, I got to give myself a timeout, okay? People give kids I give myself a timeout. And then I say to myself, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Or it is to a man's wisdom, right? A man's wisdom gives him patience. It is to his glory to overlook an offense. And so that's how we teach people to lead themselves well, right? They got to understand God's in charge. We follow him. John 15:5 says, I am the vine, you're the branches. If you remain in me, you will bear much fruit, but apart from me, you can do nothing. Number two, you got to know how God's gifted you, and you got to lock down and develop and use those strengths. And number three, you got to understand what are your potential character flaws, and how do you move aggressively to deal with them so that they don't get you, okay? Now, I'm going to stop right here. If you're interested in learning how to lead other people and how to lead teams, we're going to talk about that a little later this afternoon. Thanks.